I'm Erin and I'm here with a number of colleagues, but I want to introduce you specifically to Kate Askew here. We are both resource consent planners at the Christchurch City Council, so our role is predominantly administration of the city plan, processing resource consents and providing public advice to people like you who are interested in developments and activities, tiny houses and things. Kate and I both jumped at the opportunity to come to this meeting and meet with the tiny house community. It's something that we are personally both interested in. This is Kate's family. This is her step number one, I think, towards maybe a future tiny home. And this next slide is me and my family. That's our Nolex 25. Tiny home of sorts. We spend a month in that over Christmas up at the Able Tasman, and it's all self-contained. Just before I get into things, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between planning resource consents and building consents, because they're two areas that people tend to get quite confused or merged together. Planning is based on the Resource Management Act, and out of that, local authorities are required to prepare a district plan, which is done through a public notification process. The building side of it is based on the Building Act and the Building Code, so they're quite separate pieces of legislation. They each have quite different purposes and principles. So David's going to talk later about the building consent side of things, but essentially that relates more to the structural safety of the building, fire safety and accessibility and those sorts of things. Whereas on the planning side of things, we're concerned about the environmental effects of different uses on the land. And just to note that because each district plan is prepared regionally, obviously the rules for the Christchurch City Council will differ to what you'll find in Waimakariri or Selwyn District Council. Right. So what I'm going to cover, and I'm going to do this really briefly, lots of time for question and answers afterwards, is Christchurch District Plan and zoning. We'll have a look at where a tiny house fits within the Christchurch District Plan, a very brief touch on some of the relevant district plan rules, and touching on resource consents. And at the end, I'll just provide you with a list of places that you can go to find out further information about resource consents and planning if you're interested. So this here is the Christchurch District Plan. It's a bit of a beast. You'll find it online on the Christchurch City Council website. Along this side here you can see a whole list of chapters which cover various rules and provisions. And if you click anywhere on this bit here, you can bring up the planning maps. So if you've got a site in mind and you want to find out how it's zoned, then just click on there, box will come up and you can enter the address of your site. If you bring up the next slide, this is an example of a planning map. The Christchurch District Plan uses zoning as a mechanism for controlling land uses, and this is just a planning map which shows an area of islands. So got Maidstone Road here, Waimari Road down there, and you can see different colour codes with a key over here. All of that yellow area is zoned residential suburban. We've got a pocket of residential suburban density transition. Those are your two sort of key low density residential areas that you find across much of the flat area of Christchurch. You see there's a pocket of commercial here and open space community park there. I think that's Radlink Park. So the important thing to note is that the different zones have different rule packages to provide for different types of activities and developments. And I was going to say, switch. There are heaps of different rules across different zones, so it's impossible really to cover every scenario and situation that might arise here tonight during this presentation. So I'm really sort of focusing my presentation more towards those low density residential sites that you'd find typically across the flat areas in Christchurch. So where does a tiny house fit within the Christchurch district plan? It's a good question. We first need to go to the Chapter 2 abbreviations and definitions, have a look at the definition of building and residential unit. Bring up the next slide. So a building essentially means any structure or part of a structure, whether permanent, movable or immovable. And just down here it includes any vehicle, trailer, tent, marquee, shipping container, caravan or boat, whether fixed or movable, used on site as a residential unit or a place of business. So I think that definition makes it quite clear that a tiny house, for the purposes of the district plan, is deemed to be a building. Now you'll just note that on the building consent side of things, they have different definition of building. So this is for the purpose of the planning rules. A tiny house is also deemed to be a residential unit, so bring up that definition. That means a self-contained building or unit used for a residential activity by one or more persons who forms a single household. And you can see here that as soon as you add a kitchen into a building, it essentially becomes a residential unit. So if, for example, you had a site that had a typical residential dwelling on it, and you wanted to put a tiny house on the back of it, and it was self-contained with a kitchen, under the district plan rules, you'd be deemed to have 2 residential units on that one site. Next page. Looking briefly at the district plan rules. The plan basically prescribes rules in relation to buildings and residential units, so they're all going to apply to your tiny houses. It places restrictions on the number of residential units that you can have per site, and there are also a number of built form standards. These are essentially those standards that control where on the site you can actually put your tiny house. There are also rules about car parking, hazards, noise and urban design, and I'll touch on each of these a little bit later. The basic thing I guess to take from it is that if you breach a rule in the district plan, you're looking at the need for a resource consent. Moving on. Minimum lot size. What does this mean for tiny houses? Well, generally on any established residential lot within the city, you are permitted to have a residential unit. So that residential unit might be a standard dwelling, or it might be a tiny house. Just as an example, in the residential suburban zone, you're allowed to have 1 residential unit per, must have a minimum net site area of at least 450 metres squared. So that varies, of course, across other zones, but I haven't got time to go into them all, so that's just an example. Move on to the next slide. Just in our recent district plan review, another mechanism was introduced, and that relates to minor residential units. Minor residential units are essentially a secondary unit which is detached and is allowed to establish on a site that already has a residential unit on it. So yeah, there are rules around minor residential units on most of the rural zones and most of the lower density residential zones. Now, this example that I'm giving here and the rules that relate to it relate again to the residential suburban zone. So the existing site for both of the units has to have a minimum net site area of 450 metres squared. The minor residential unit has to have a minimum gross floor area of between 35 metres squared and 80 metres squared. I'll touch on that shortly. Parking and excuse me, access from both of the units need to be accessed from the same single access, and there are also some provisions around outdoor living space. So theoretically, you could potentially provide a second residential unit on a site if it was to meet all of this and all of the other standards under the plan. You could do that as a permitted activity. But what I'm thinking is that in the case of tiny houses, I understand they're typically quite a lot smaller than 35 metres squared. So if you guys want to have a second minor residential unit on a site in this sort of situation, you're going to be looking at a need for a resource consent. So
that's GFA's ground floor area, was it? Did that include mezzanines?
Gross floor area, did I say ground? Sorry, I probably did.
Gross.
Yeah, gross floor area. So that will include your floor area plus a mezzanine, if that's what you've got. When assessing a resource consent that triggers a non-compliance associated with a minor residential unit, we need to consider the context of the site. So we would look at the location. Is it visually hidden from the road? Does it leave the site with a similar street scene as your typical sort of single residential unit? So that might be a cue to think, well, maybe it's best for me to locate my tiny house round the back, perhaps, rather than in the front yard. We'd look at the adverse visual effects associated with parking and accesses. So hopefully there would just be one access. Obviously, the more driveways and the more car parking spaces, the more permeable surfaces and the less room for landscaping, all the rest of it. So those elements can change the character of the site quite a lot. If you could just go back, sorry. Size and visual appearance. This is an interesting one, but it does give the council some scope to consider the internal layout of the tiny house and how it relates to the outdoor living space. My understanding is that most tiny houses are quite bespoke, and probably this community puts a lot of effort into how they design and lay out their tiny houses. So this may not be an issue for most people, but it does give the council to sort of some scope to look at whether or not these units are being used as slum-like accommodation for students or workers' accommodation, or as a really sort of cheap option for rental without a good quality living environment. We also look at the convenience, location, accessibility and size of the outdoor living space. So the better relationship that you have with the outdoor space, the more likely we're able to support a second tiny house that's undersized. Next slide. Built form standards. These are some of the main ones that apply. We've got site coverage. That's the percentage of actual building across a site. Just as an example, on a residential suburban site, you can cover up to 35% of the site by way of buildings. So if you're looking for a site, you might want to sort of focus on those ones that have got quite a lot of open space rather than already being covered in buildings. Boundary setbacks from site boundaries and road boundary. There are also recession plane requirements which control how close and how high to an internal boundary you can go, and also outdoor living space requirements. Parking. There is a requirement for one car parking space per tiny house unit. So any residential unit that's less than 150 metres squared requires a car parking space. Even if you don't have a car, you need to show a car parking space on the site. Where the car park is not a garage, it's also important to note that you'd be required to provide one accessible and secure covered cycle parking space as well on the site somewhere. Noise. Any tiny house that's located in close proximity to a highway or a busy road, I'm talking like sort of 40 or 20 metres or so, will be required or subject to additional requirements around noise and acoustic insulation. So just something to bear in mind when you're looking for a site. Natural hazards. We've got a number of hazards that are mapped across Christchurch. They relate to flooding, slope instability and liquefaction. This, you probably can't really see it, but that's just a close-up of one of the planning maps where you can see a flood management area going around Waimea Terrace sort of area. The most common one you'll probably come across on the flat really is the flood management area. And typically you can make your building comply provided that you raise the floor levels up to the minimum floor level requirements. But just an important note is that we do have some sites, like this wee pocket here, which are zoned in the high flood management area. And in those zones, it may be very difficult to get resource consent for a new residential dwelling. So to avoid those areas. Urban design principles, if you have 3 or more residential units, and this applies mainly to the more high density, sort of medium density and above zones, then you'd be required to get resource consent and we'd assess it against urban design, residential design principles, and Boyd is going to touch on those just shortly. Resource consents required for any rule breach, I'm really sorry. And I just want to reiterate that the council doesn't go out of their way to try and find people who have activities that aren't lawfully established. Most of the time people will come to us in the early stages and organise a pre-application meeting, suss out what the rules are, and so they know what they're getting themselves into. But 9 times out of 10, if we do come across something, it's usually brought to the council's attention by a member of the public. And if that does happen, then the council is obligated to investigate and take appropriate action. And here's just a list of resources. Too difficult for most of you to read, I imagine, but there's the district plan. Obviously, that's your first point of call. Type on the site, find out what zone it's in, have a look to see if there are any other overlays and things that are applicable, like hazards, heritage buildings and the like, work from there. We also have a duty planner who is available to answer questions that you might have. There's the tiny house information question and answers package that Paul referred to earlier, and yeah, as I understand that was formulated with you guys, so you should be aware of that. And yeah, just some other general places to go to for information on resource consents and the like. I'll hand you over to Boyd.
Kia ora, my name is Boyd. I'm an urban designer at the Christchurch City Council, so we work quite a lot with the resource consent planners. Go to the next slide. And we also do some other things as well around the city, so I get to have a bit more bit of project work and a bit of resource consent work. So what is urban design? I've described it here as the composition of a collection of buildings and spaces. The actual definition is quite disputed, but I think for the purposes here today, it is mostly when we are talking about sites that have multiple houses on them, 3 or more, 4 or more, depending on the zone. Sometimes we get brought in onto resource consents when there are quite sort of tricky sites, or sometimes even really small sites. If they're less than, I think, 150 square metres, they also get what's applied as the sort of residential design principles, which is the key rule that, that us urban designers sort of apply to houses. Just to reiterate, pre-application meetings are really awesome. They do cost you a little bit of money for the planner. My time is free, but early on in the process, that gives us the opportunity to kind of talk things over, highlight any potential issues, or provide any sort of tips that might help the application. And you the earlier you can do that, the better in terms of helping that process, or potentially if the site's just not going to work, it's good to know before you spend too much money. If you're planning on doing a tiny house village with sort of 8 or more units, we've also got the urban design panel, which is a sort of independent panel, and they can also help sort of shape how it might fit together. Next slide. So I'm just going to go quickly through the residential design principles, and keep in mind these are more for when we've got multiple units on one site. So the first one is city context and character, and that's about how the building is within keeping sort of its surroundings, whether it's the houses immediately adjacent or some parts of the city have character area overlays on them, which sort of identify key characteristics. That's a bit of a joke, by the way. I'm not suggesting you match your house to the house next door, but I suppose sometimes taking some design cues. And it also, that part of the sort of principle talks about mature trees and waterways, and sort of if there's consistent setbacks within neighbouring properties as well. Next one, relationship to the street and public spaces. So when we're getting multiple units, we're really strong on having a really positive street frontage or a frontage to open space. So that's sort of orientating buildings toward the street, front doors, front windows. The rule kind of talks about having a habitable space onto the street, which is probably more designed for a house with multiple rooms. If you've got just one room, that sort of ticks the box. But I suppose then there's a question there about privacy as well. I think there could be a bit of a tension between providing sort of overlook of the street, but then also being looked into. But that's sort of something that you could probably talk about or discuss site specifically. The next one is built form and appearance. So this rule also talks about avoiding bulky and long buildings and having a human scale, which I think tiny houses probably okay on that one as well. That's more to try and avoid sort of sausage blocks that we have a lot of here in Christchurch. And it also talks about sometimes architectural elements, details, and if you go to the next slide. Hola. I think you should be fine for this. So residential amenity. This is potentially one where things do get a little bit tricky. So the rule sort of seeks to have a high level of amenity, both internal and external. And that's both for the occupants and the neighbours. And we talk about neighbours in terms of sort of privacy and overlooking and overshadowing. So this sort of gives us an opportunity where it against those multiple buildings. So it's when you're sort of putting 3 or 4 or 5 buildings together in a row, or however you lay them out, it's to ensure that there's still adequate privacy and separation, and you're not unduly affecting the properties next door or within each other. And to a certain extent, if we look at this as if we were the occupant, not necessarily the owner. And that's because sometimes owners are more inclined to just allow things to go through if they're going to rent them out. But we also kind of put the hat on as a tenant. And landscaping becomes quite key as well. Erin sort of mentioned that we do like to see that each unit would have a nice little outdoor area to work on, to live in. And particularly if you've got a tiny house with minimal internal space, it might be that actually you have quite a nice outdoor space to sort of compensate. And that comes into that as well. Access, parking and servicing. So it's quite discouraging of having car parking to the street. So if you can get car parking and access out the back, that's good. And I think you'd want that too, and particularly if you do have a tiny house that is movable, how you're actually going to get it in, turn it around and get it out again, or how well that works. So we potentially look at that, particularly if there's multiple on the site again. The next one is safety. This is where I think multi-unit sites in the past have often sometimes created unsafe environments. And so this rule is sort of in there to kind of see how those properties can sort of look after each other, but also look after the street, and make sure that there's good sort of bit of passive surveillance across the site. And so that just means maybe when you're designing your layout, consider where windows are located or doors are located. But it is also about balancing a bit of your own privacy too. And then the last one, there is another principle about hillside and small settlements, and these are quite site specific. So if we're talking up in the Port Hills or potentially out in the Peninsula, it gives us a little bit of scope to sort of consider what's going on in and around there. It just talks about working with the topography of the land, particularly on the hills, and looking after some views as well. Although I suspect if you've got quite a small house, the views probably won't be a real problem either, blocking the views of neighbours. So that's a very quick overview of my stuff, and I'll pass you on.
Well, hello, I'm David Hutt. I'm Principal Building Official at the City Council. So I'm going to start right at the beginning. The other two have talked firstly about council rules. I'm not talking about council rules. These are government rules. The Building Act is central. The building code is is the same throughout New Zealand. So what I talk about is not just specific to council. So it's not council requirements, it's government requirements. I'm going to start right at the purposes of the Building Act in the first place, to give you some context about what we're talking about. This is very simplistic what I've written here, but it's basically straight out of the purposes of the Building Act. It's about the regulation of building work, setting of building standards to ensure you've got safety, and that includes fire safety and structural safety. It's about ensuring you've got health when you've got a building or a house, whatever. You've got health, physical independence, and the well-being of people is protected. And it also is there to protect the accountability of owners, builders, building consent authorities, so we all do the right thing. Click on to the next.
I actually might have missed your slide. I'm really sorry.
What, other ones? What was I going to talk about? Right. I was going to talk next about the very common question, which is, what is a building and what is a vehicle, which is the most common thing that comes up with tiny houses. Going straight back to the purposes and principles, what the government intends is people to live in safe, sanitary houses with adequate amenity. Now, in the definitions of what is a building and what is not, it excludes vehicles. Now, that's for good reason. That's for when you've got your caravan or your motorhome. You don't have to get a building consent every time you park it up. It's not there the intention for people to live permanently in caravans or in motorhomes. The way it's been written, it's been quite a lot of development on this over the years, and that what is a vehicle? There's been lots of discussions over the years about what is a vehicle, what is a building, what is a movable building. So going back to what the principles of the purpose of the Building Act, you'll see people are using tiny houses as a means not to get a building consent and not to comply with the building code. Just by having wheels on it, you can expect to be questioned. It might well be still a vehicle, but it's not the intention of government to be living permanently in caravans or equivalent. Now, there's been quite a number of determinations about this, and this is on the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment has a determinations team which you can get where people challenge decisions made by building consent authorities. And there's a number of these that have been about this vehicle versus building question. And you'll find numerous ones at the back now. They started putting an appendix, a decision tree. Obviously some of you have seen it. And that's developed over time. So if you look at some of the older decisions, you might find they're slightly different now than what they were a few years ago. We've had one go through just very recently. Someone, certainly not a tiny house, but someone claiming this building was a vehicle. On the advice of the builder, which I think the builder, the owner, Australia actually, but it was 6.3 metres wide, it was 12.3 metres long, and had a 2.1 metre long veranda completely along one side. It had a series of 5 axles along it, and they were led to believe this was a vehicle and it didn't require building consent. Looked like a house, smelled like a house, it tasted like a house, it was a house. So that was very unfortunate, I think, because they put it up there in good faith thinking it was, they didn't need building consent. Came to our attention and we had to do something about it. So it is quite complex at times whether something is a vehicle or a building or a movable structure they talk about more often these days. As soon as you attach 2 of these together, there is actually case law that says as soon as you attach a couple of these together, they do become a building. Determination isn't case law as such, so theoretically doesn't set a precedent, but it does give us a good idea of what to look at. So that's a little bit about the vehicle discussion. Now we'll come along to building code. A lot of people think the building code is very difficult to achieve. The building code itself is actually quite simplistic. What is more complex is all the acceptable solutions that say this is one way you can meet the building code. There's a New Zealand standard for timber frame housing, which people talk about a great deal, NZS 3604. That's only one way of meeting the building code. Now, I'm suggesting to you for tiny houses, more often than not, you're not going to use an acceptable solution as a way of complying with the building code. That's small. The structure, putting the 150 studs in, you're not going to do that. Doesn't mean they're not safe, doesn't mean they don't comply with the building code, it just means they're different, and it's a responsibility of the designer, whether it be yourself or someone you employ, to actually demonstrate to the council that it actually is structurally sound and does work. It's a little bit more difficult than using a cookie cutter solution, but it can be done. Probably the most common issue I see with tiny houses and not complying with the building code is with the stairs. Now the building code doesn't say you have to have stairs which are a certain width or a certain height or a certain tread length. That's an acceptable solution, but it's not the only way of doing it. Basically, they need to be safe. You need to have a handrail. You need to have some protection from some safety from falling. Safety from falling is potentially a bit of an issue with some of these mezzanine floors I see in some of them. But it's not the end of the world. You've got to think outside the square so you can verify to the council that it actually complies, meets the minimum standard of the building code. There's a lot I could talk about sanitary facilities and your connections to services. Often if you've got what is effectively a caravan, albeit quite big caravans, and you intend to keep it as a vehicle and move it around occasionally, you might want to hook it up to some services when you come and park up on your site. Those services will generally need a building consent in themselves. But if you want your tiny house to remain a vehicle, any connections to them will normally be a quick disconnect, like you would for, I don't know, caravan parks have quick disconnect type systems. You hook up by a hose tap to your water supply. Your electrical supply is your electrical plug for your standard type caravan one, not a permanent connection. So this all changes how movable it is and whether we can still consider it to be a vehicle. There's the rest of my slides. Okay, so we talk about building code. As far as, we've talked a little bit about the services there. It really depends to a certain extent whether you're going to say, okay, this is just a very small house and we put it on foundations. Could effectively be the same as the construction could be the same as one on wheels, but it just happens you accept that it's going to be a house, it's going to be there for a while. It complies with the building code, which is what we need to see. Effectively the building code says very simple, yeah. It's not going to kill you, it's not going to kill anyone else. It's going to have suitable amenity. It's not going to waste energy. That's sort of some real basics of the building code. It's, if I printed out the building code as such, it's not this, it's more like this. In its simplest form. So yeah, probably most of you, if you're thinking about living in a tiny home, you like thinking outside the square. The building code actually does give you the ability to think outside the square and do something different, but it just becomes a little bit more complex, or quite a bit more complex, to actually demonstrate that it complies. But yeah, the Building Act, right back from '91, was written with the intention of giving some people flexibility to do what they want. It just puts the onus on the designer to actually design something that actually works and complies with the minimum standards of the building code. And the building code is minimum standards. It's not, if you comply with the minimum standards, it doesn't necessarily mean you've got good building design. It just means it meets the minimums that the government expects of people. Obviously, he doesn't want people to live in, we don't want people living in slums or wasting energy. With a tiny home, generally they're so small they take very little energy to actually heat anyway, so heat or cool. So energy efficiency is not usually a big deal as it will be in a 300 square metre mansion.
Okay. Katrina, I believe, isn't it?
Right, mine won't take nearly so long to talk about. So I manage the team who assess the development contributions. So for those of you who don't know what development contributions are, so it's a one-off charge by the council for the increased demand and growth for infrastructure, things like network infrastructure such as stormwater, wastewater, transport and reserves. So every time that an application is received by the council for either building consent, resource consent, certificate of acceptance or service connections, we assess it for development contributions. So what that is we look at, say for a standard residential unit, we would call that 1 HUI. So every residential site basically has a credit of 1 HUI. So if you were putting a second unit on that needed either building consent or resource consent, you'd be assessed for development contributions. If you're putting something on a vacant site that maybe had a house previously that had been demolished, there would already be the benefit of 1 HUI credit on there, so you wouldn't have to pay sites for the additional sites over the one generally, just depending on what's been in there in the past. And the cost can vary depending on where you are. So 1 HUI charge for like an extra unit on a property would range between 11,000 and 24,000. But when we're talking about tiny houses, we do have a couple of things that we do to recognise that it won't create as much demand as a usual residential unit. So under the policy, if it's 60, we take it down to 60% if the gross floor area is 60 square metres or less. So you'd only be paying 60% of the charge, so whatever the charge was in the area that you were doing. And we also have a rebate scheme for small units which can take it down to 50% if it was under 60 square metres. So basically, if you're looking at something like, say, 35 metres gross floor area, you'd possibly be paying a maximum of 50% at the moment of what the standard HUI charges are. There's possibly the policy analyst is possibly looking at reducing that further, but that won't be until the next policy, and that will be based on consultation and feedback with the council and stuff like that, and whatever they determine is appropriate at the time. And if you want to find out, if you're looking at a certain area, what you'd be paying, if you go to our website, you can actually assess what a standard residential HUI is for certain areas. So say if you had an address you type in, it'll tell you what catchment you're in and what the charge would be, so you can get a rough estimate, or you can speak to someone in my team and they'll be able to tell you as well. So that's really not much else to say, but if you've got any questions, you can look on the website, or we can give you some further information about what the charges would be.
We'll lead with the Q&A, so try and keep it to a question rather than statements if possible. And Paul, how do you want to, should we just pick out whoever's dealing with that area?
I think so. Happy to go through you, Kyle.
Sure, so just fire away, who's got questions?
With the minimum unit size, 35 square metres, does that include accessory buildings?
Well, yeah, it would include accessory buildings. Yeah.
So that could include,
yeah.
like it says, things like swimming pools, glass houses, solar panels.
It's going
tiny house could be an accessory building that didn't have a kitchen in it, because it's that kitchen which makes it a residential unit.
Yeah, so,
if
but I'm
you
talking
didn't-
about the minimum unit size being 35 square metres. Does that 35 square metres include any accessory buildings? And I think on the council website it outlines some of those accessory buildings, doesn't it?
So it would include the like the shed or attached garage that was associated with the minor residential unit.
So you could have a tiny house and a shed.
But not a swimming pool.
No. I think that was listed in the council definition of an accessory building for once.
Oh,
That's why I
right.
was saying that. So,
Interesting.
so you could have a tiny house and a
So what
shed.
you can do is you can go to the definition and it's the plan of gross floor area and spell it out really clearly. But no, it doesn't include a swimming pool. Yes, it includes a shed or a garage and the tiny house.
So what actually defines a kitchen then?
That's a really interesting question. Typically anything that has a bench and a sink and electrical sockets where you could put a microwave or a stove, a cooker or something like that. So
Okay, so
it's quite basic.
If you had like an outdoor gas cooker, like a camping gas portable thing, if you were to use that, is that a definition of a kitchen?
I would probably say that sits outside of the
Okay.
definition of a kitchen. It would have to be sort of a specific working area inside the unit. But I say a bench and the sink and a
It's
place
about,
where you could
it's
put
about
the
how you're going to use the
equipment.
space. I mean, if you're planning on living there permanently, then it's not really. I mean, you are using it as a residential unit, and there'll be times when you don't go out. So it's kind of not okay just to have a a grill outside that you're going to use to get around there.
Okay,
So
I
really
guess,
how they use it.
So me personally, I'm building this tiny house more as a transition piece. So currently building it, but then I'll be buying a section, but building a proper house on it. And the tiny house will be accommodation while the bigger house is being built. And then when we're living in the bigger house, the tiny house will be accommodation for when families visit. So the kitchen aspect would just be a gas cooker if they wanted to cook something for themselves, but most of the time they'd be using the kitchen in the main building. So is that just a really
Well, you touched
grey
on
area?
some of these things like family flats. There's other sort of uses which you kind of, if it's a family member that's dependent on the main household.
Oh,
that's
this would be
into,
like
but-
a mother that visits once a year over Christmas time.
It's the sort of thing that council would sort of turn a blind eye to
Okay.
some extent, in the same way that if you use your caravan for as the kitchen for
Yeah.
it's the majority of the time if it's just sitting out there as an sort of accessory building.
Yeah.
And you've got a family that's coming in and they're not really cooking in the caravan, they're coming in to eat with you, then that is
Okay.
the accessory building.
Something just to note there that the definition for development contributions is slightly different. So it's just a sink capable of creating a self-contained unit. So if you had a shower in that and then you had something and called it a laundry sink, that would more than likely be assessed for development contributions. So that while we quite often try to align, it's not necessarily always the case. We take
I guess my
different view on it.
personal viewpoint is I'm okay with paying rates and all of that kind of stuff. For me, I'm going to be using those resources anyway. I'm just more thinking for the square meterage and how you could only have one residential unit per such a size. The sections that we're looking at, are kind of just under 900 square metres. So I just kind of had to think, will that affect it? Will we need to look for something bigger, kind of thing?
It'd probably be worth going into council, actually sitting down, if you're planning on doing that, would that be a recommendation, talk to a planner?
You've got quite a specific proposal, and that's the
Yeah,
sort of thing that the pre-app is for, and if you've got a site in mind, then you can come in or we can discuss
Okay,
this.
because the sites are selling so quickly that
There's also a general planning line,
okay.
which is on the council that you can ask general planning questions.
Okay.
So that's also available. It's just a 94189999 number, and speak to a planning, and they'll put you through.
Say for building information. Same number.
Question?
Yeah, thanks. I've got a question for David.
Yes.
I purchased a tiny home from a builder who builds tiny homes, and I put it on some rented land to which I'm paying rent on, and the due to the landlord, I don't know, there was an issue with, he asked the council for bins, but he was paying a low rate, so technically there should be no rate. So anyway, the council came out and they deemed my tiny house a building.
Okay.
And then we applied and it's been again denied as a vehicle. It's been reclassified. So I was given a month to leave the property.
Okay.
But then after all the discussions, they've decided that they're going to give me to the end of my lease because I'm unwell in order to leave.
Yeah.
So my question, I guess, to you is my next course now, because my builder doesn't have it didn't get building consent when he built them because it's designed for the road.
Mm-hmm.
And he seems to think I'm not going to get building consent because of the way it's designed. Is my best course to get a determination, which has been suggested by the council,
Determination's always an option.
or to try and get a building consent, because currently I'm in a tiny home to which I have to leave, but technically can't put it anywhere because I don't have a determination and I can't get a building consent, so I'm actually stuck.
The option to get a building, well, you can't get a building consent after something's been built.
Oh, so I can't, so that's done.
But no, there is another system that's called a certificate of acceptance, which means when someone's constructed something without a building consent and hasn't gone through the process, you can actually, that's effectively a retrospective building consent.
Is that what you suggest I do? Because I feel like I'm a little bit...
To get one of those, you need to demonstrate it complies with the building code though. If your builder's got difficulty saying it complies with the building code, and presumably
Well, it's something to do with the height, and it's designed to go on the road.
Mm-hmm.
It's currently warranted and registered, and it's insured as a motorhome, and it's on wheels and it's completely detachable. It's a typical tiny home. And there was, I don't know, he's built 9 of them, so I guess he...
Yeah.
So now I'm kind of, but I purchased it, it's 4 or 5 months ago.
Yeah.
So I have to be out by March next year.
I might have heard of that, actually.
Yeah, probably.
I know one where there was, it's probably your one where they decided it was pointless trying to throw you out of it too soon.
Because I was ill and I was in hospital,
No, there was a limited time anyway, so it was pragmatic just to say,
okay.
We're not overs.
No, so I'm just not sure what my next step would be.
Okay, it's probably a little bit difficult to answer your one up front here.
All right.
We'll talk to you afterwards if you like.
All right, that'd be great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Any more questions? I've got a couple that have been sent through anonymously because the council's so scary. What is the process for a determination? For example, to determine if a structure is a building or a vehicle, who determines who assesses the determination?
The determination, India have got a specific team that deal with this, and they've got their own advisors in there. It's quite, they operate quite separately from us. Well, they are completely separate with central government, but it's even separate from the other parts of MB because they need to be seen to be independent. So the determination process is for residential, it's only $250 plus GST. It costs them many thousands or tens of thousands to process each one, but for the applicant it's only $250 plus GST. So it is actually quite a cheap process. It can take quite a while. Theoretically, they go through within 60 working days. I'm not sure if I've ever seen one go through that quick. I've seen one go through that quick. We try, and with determinations, we work as hard as we can to give a very balanced perspective of those. From my perspective, we can't lose with a determination. Now the reason is either we find out, because we don't try and do things wrong in the first place, but we either find out that we were right, or we learn something and move on. So
does it have to be built to go for that determination, or can you do it off plans?
No, you can do it. Yeah, it doesn't need to be built. You can get a determination to determine whether something complies with the building code, or you can get a determination to challenge a decision that's been made by the council. So the council has refused to issue a building consent, or has refused a certificate of acceptance, or made a particular decision, issued a notice to fix a few things wrong. You can get MD to make an independent decision on that, can override our decision.
You mentioned earlier about, you alluded to case law, but then you said, oh well hang on, it's not case law. Can you clarify around that a little bit about these
determinations?
determinations?
Aren't case law because it's not through the courts, it's a sub-judicial type process. There is case law and I have seen it referred to there, Thames Coromandel District Council versus Tempura Holiday Park Limit 2010 NZCA 633 is case law, and that's the one that talks about the when you connect the buildings together, connect the vehicles together, they become a building. So other than that, there's not a lot of case law. Probably nice if someone challenged, you go through a determination, then you can challenge that determination through the court. It'd be quite nice for some of those to go through because it falls some of the issues.
So is the determination site specific? Like you mentioned before, you can get a determination of plans as a possibility, but therefore would it be site specific? So if I said I'm going to build a tiny house and I haven't got my site yet, but I want it clarified as a vehicle, not a building.
The way I read it, all the ones I've seen so far have been. The way I read it, it says specifically you can get that clarification whether something complies with the building code. That vehicle versus building decision, though, that's really would need to be challenge a decision made by the council. So if you haven't got a site, we won't make a decision. I have seen one or two decisions that are made, or determinations that have been made where they have made a determination on a decision the council proposed to make. A little bit out of the ordinary.
There really needs to be a challenger and a...
it's the council versus, as I say, we welcome them because we can't lose. If we learn something, that's good. We try our best to get things right. We don't always get things right. If someone comes in with a different decision for good reason, yeah, fine.
Before I got to just going back to the two tiny houses joined together.
Yes.
If they can be taken apart within a day, would that be considered mobile or immobile based on that?
Based on that decision, I would say no.
No, okay.
It's still a building.
Even if it was held together with like 4 bolts and took 5 minutes just to separate.
I think that is, when you've got a court case, so that becomes case law. So.
If I may add to that, I think one of the issues with that particular case was that the buildings were joined at right angles.
Yeah.
Is that correct? I think I remember that.
I believe so, right.
And there was a time when a different determination was made if they were joined linearly, end on.
There's
but it seems like it's changing as some of them.
it has developed because as these become more common, there's some of the decisions made by MB, probably older ones, they wouldn't necessarily come to the same decision now as they would have a few years back. They're getting a lot more consistent now.
If classified as a mobile structure, what regulations for fireplaces do exist?
If it's classified as a
mobile structure, so just a tiny house.
Well, if it's a building, it's just same as any, just standard here.
For a vehicle?
No, don't care.
Doesn't come under the building.
You've got them on tape for that.
If it's a vehicle, hey, look, my car's got the engine, that little fire that goes every.
True.
Yeah.
You mentioned an interim category of movable structure at one point, or somebody did.
I did. Yes.
Could you say a bit more about that?
Well, a lot of the more recent determinations have sort of tried to, because a building includes a a structure, whether movable or immovable. So the more recent determinations have tried to make a differentiate between what is a vehicle and what is a movable structure. Just because it's got wheels on it doesn't necessarily make it a vehicle, although it might be movable. But,
does roadworthiness come into that, or?
Roadworthiness, yes and no. If you've got a vehicle that's registered and warranted, that's not actually a requirement for it to be a vehicle, but it is a good indicator that it is a vehicle if it is registered and warranted. But it's just one of the little things you can look at that might guide you towards it being more of a vehicle.
And in that document, which has been prepared, they actually list out some of the things, so things like brakes, suspension, how the axles are built, things like that. It's not just a simple black and white. I think there's like quite a criteria, and the more boxes you tick, the closer it is to a vehicle's approved.
It's about, at the end of the day, there's a little bit of a grey area in some ways. It'd be nice to change the Building Act to make it very clear one way or the other, but changing an Act of Parliament is, they're more interested in Kiwi building, making more houses. Why tiny houses can't be part of that solution, I don't know. I'm sure they could be, but here's your opportunity to lobby government.
Do you know of a tiny house, an actual tiny house that's been had a determination on it? I've seen a lot of the things about movable house structures and things in the houses that have been there at Maxwell's, but has there been one recently where a tiny house has gone for a determination?
No, most ones I've seen are bigger than a tiny house.
Yeah, so no one's actually put one through yet.
Not recently, I don't think. But that's just a printout of the information sheet that's on there.
We're currently building a website as well, and we're hoping to have all these as resources listed on the website, so stay tuned. Another question, people are confused about regulation regarding being immobile and permanently occupied to be categorised as building. However, many tiny houses which are permanently occupied but mobile are considered a building under the Building Act. Why?
You really need to refer to the determination. Well, I've extracted some of the words out of determinations into this information sheet here. It has developed over time, as I said right at the start. You look at the purposes of the Building Act in the first place. You're trying to create safe sanitary buildings. Vehicles in there as not requiring building consent, predominantly I think because you don't need to get a building consent every time you park your caravan on your site, which you're going to use a few times a year for your boat. It's not intended that what is your permanent home doesn't need building consent.
That raises the question, is building consent site specific? Do you have to get a new one if you move? Let's say you were unlucky and got classified as a building, even though it was a tiny house and it was movable down the road, but you then want to move sites. You'd have to get another building consent.
It's specific to the site, yes. But once you have a building consent for a building, it becomes an existing building. So you only need a building consent for the building work you're going to do. So moving from one site and plonking on another is not building work. What is building work is putting your foundations in or you're putting your services in. So if you get a building consent to build it on one site, that's fine, put foundations and whatever. And if you want to pick it up, we can put it on a truck, move it down the road. All you need consent for is for the foundations and services, whatever.
But if you don't have those, you're not doing foundation work.
If it's a building, you have.
Well, if it's a tiny house on wheels.
If it's a tiny house on wheels, well, this is where we get the complexities about which is a vehicle or not, because certainly a tiny house on wheels wouldn't necessarily comply with the building code for structure.
So if you built a tiny house on wheels that to get building consent, for the requirements of building consent,
you would need to be looking at how are you going to fix that in position.
Well, you're not.
Well, it wouldn't comply with the building code then.
So you can't call it a building, it's a
Well,
vehicle.
we can call it a building, but it doesn't comply with the building code.
So in theory, a tiny house could never be a building.
So if you're unlucky enough to be classified as a building, you have to put it on foundations, basically.
And then, no, you can quite welcome to. This is where I said the building code is very simplistic. It's really just basically it's got to be safe. What happens if you get very strong winds? Is if it's just sitting
Well,
on
that
wheels.
would be an advantage if you could join two at 90 degrees.
But that's why I'm saying you've got to think outside the square, and this is where you could challenge. And it wouldn't necessarily be easy, but what say about just putting it on blocks and have tethers around the outside to hold it in place over, I don't know, might be thinking differently. Put some concrete pads in the ground and put some blocks in and tie it
So
down.
if you're doing everything correctly, or if you're trying to do everything correctly and you're just building it on a certain site and you don't know where you're going to put it in the future, what would you do? Do you get a building consent before you try and go through that process in the place that you're building it, or what's the
really
best thing
becomes
to
up
do?
to you, but for future proofing, of course.
Yeah.
If you don't know where it's going to be, how are you going to use it in the future?
Yeah.
Yes, the building consent gives you some assurance that when you go forward, you've got something you can say, well, this complies with the building code, here's my evidence of that. If you want to move it down to Waitaki or whatever, and they'll say, how does this comply with the building code? Here's my evidence.
Could you possibly run through quickly what the basic process is of getting a building consent?
I'm not sure if there's anything basic about it.
Do you require a licensed building practitioner if you own a builder?
Sorry?
Do you require a licensed building practitioner if you own a builder?
No. No, you need to sign a statement saying you're an owner builder. That's fine, but no. If you own a builder, you don't need a licensed building practitioner.
You need to submit a set of plans.
You need to submit plans which demonstrate compliance with the building code. It's the responsibility of the designer to actually demonstrate compliance with the building code.
Would attaching photographic evidence of the building process help as well, if it was already built?
If it's already built.
Oh no, I mean, it's a tiny house with a trailer, so, you know, you're using it as a vehicle, and then when it goes to become a permanent structure, you're looking for a certificate of compliance and whatever it was.
There's all sorts of ifs, buts, maybes here.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to confuse things, but if you build, if for example, it's a caravan, let's call it, it's a big fancy caravan. That's what you're saying it is.
Yeah.
So call it a tiny house or caravan, whatever. And you're changing it to become a house, so you're changing its use. So you need to demonstrate that it complies with the building code somehow. The council needs to be satisfied on reasonable grounds that it complies. That doesn't mean satisfied to the nth degree and have complete enough proof. We just got to have good reason to think it complies. And that circumstance, photographs, plans, any sort of evidence, it all forms part of that collective reasonable grounds.
I have a question on costs generally.
Lots.
Yeah, I think it would be just good, my understanding of, just going back to resource consent, if you end up in that territory, my understanding it's about 1,100 or 1,200 for a pre-application meeting, and about 3 to 4, maybe worst case 4,500 for a resource consent application. Is that about in the ballpark?
That seems quite high.
Yeah, I think for the pre-app meeting, that seems quite high.
Okay.
It is case by case with the resource consents really. Generally speaking, the minimum deposit fee was 2,500. It's changed, hasn't it? Yeah. It's just gone up recently. But until recently it was 2,500. That's just a deposit. Inevitably, there's likely to be additional costs on top of that. What did you estimate? 3,000?
3 to 4,000, I was told.
3 to 4,000.
In a bad situation, 4.5. If it was tricky or
That could
complicated.
be the case if you're trying to put a residential unit on a clearly undersized lot and it's something that council's not looking to support, the application needs to be publicly notified or something like that, then you're looking at significantly higher costs and a longer time frame. So I would say that 4,500 at the top end would probably be right. Having said that, where there's just a minor non-compliance, it would be yes.
And in terms of something, say, less than 35 square metres, and that was the only non-compliance.
Yeah, that's probably fairly minor, so you're probably looking more about the $3,000 or something.
And for building, like, let's say it was the situation we were talking about where something's already built and you try and get the certificate of acceptance. What are the rough costs involved typically?
I don't have those off the top of my head. I don't actually work in the operational side of consenting. I fix up the stuff ups rather than leave that. I work in the claims area, so I don't have off the top of my head, but often it'll be the development contributions which are the largest costs which are involved rather than the building consent costs.
Yeah.
I
was going to say, just one thing to note with development contributions, once you've paid a development contribution on the site, the credit remains with that site. So if you move, like if you're intending to move it around, you would need to pay a development contribution at every site you went to. So if you're only there a year, because the credit stays with the site. So if someone came along after you and went on that site, they get the benefit of the credit, but it's not something that would move around with you. It's site specific.
But correct me if I'm wrong, there's an exemption for temporary up to 5 years, is that correct?
Well, that's temporary clause, and we sort of worked along with what's in the district plan. I think it's under there. That was for people who the intent there was that it's displaced because of the earthquakes and applied through the temporary accommodation under the. Erin and Kate will know more about temporary accommodation consent. This sort of thing. So they were to align with that at the time. So it was, displaced through earthquakes. They're not actually intended temporary buildings for people who, just move around. There was a purpose for that. But it's possibly something that is going to be looked at in the future as part of this discussion, how we could manage that. But there's no provision for it as such at the moment in terms of tiny houses.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's different to what we had in that meeting.
No.
That's okay.
Yeah, but I mean, you could probably interpret it that you could fit it into the situation here with tiny houses, but that certainly not the intent.
Okay.
Yeah.
But in theory, it could still be. In theory, possibly yes. Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's following.
But certainly not something that. I think, come the next policy, that temporary thing would be out of the development contributions policy anyway, and as part of earthquake recovery. Yeah.
Yeah,
but they could be looking to do something else.
Just going to expand on that slightly, because we were at a meeting with council back in December where we were told that there was an option to avoid DCs if you moved within a 5-year period. So that was the information we were given as part of the society. So I think that's where Kyle's.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that was purely through earthquake recovery. So it was people who had been displaced because of the earthquake. It was a lot of businesses and that had to move somewhere else because they couldn't. So they were given a dispensation for up to 5 years, and development contributions went on along with that. The intent wasn't for people to, if you didn't fit that criteria, that wasn't the intent, but that's probably not written that well in the development contributions policy, although we've never really had any cases where we've probably had one since then. We've applied it to something that doesn't fit that criteria, but that's certainly not, I wouldn't say pin your hopes on that at this stage, although it is something that's going to be discussed. Yeah.
Couple more questions. Do council need to give notice before entering a property on council matters? I'm sure would be best to answer that.
It's really more compliant.
It depends on what the issue is. Under the Building Act, we can't, with our warrants, we've all got warrants to enter. We can go onto a property, can't enter into a building, into a house, your residence, unless you give us permission. If we desperately want to get into there, we can apply for a court order to actually go inside the house to investigate. We can certainly go onto the property. In a commercial building, with our warrants, we can actually enter buildings, check for safety or non-compliances, or we've got to have reason for it. We can't just do it just on a whim. But
afternoon tea.
So no, I'm entitled to come into this building to check for for breaches, but certainly can't come into your house unless we're invited. We can ask, and as I said, we can come onto property though. Yes, we can do that.
Okay. Cool. And one last question here: is resource consent needed if only connected to existing freshwater pipe? So say like a hose connection.
That's not a resource consent. It's not.
I think Erin has talked about the definition of what a building is, and just because it's the definition for planning is a little bit different from building, and whether it's connected to services or not. If you haven't got a kitchen room, I suppose. But, yeah.
I mean, we grant approvals to sleep outs, all the time, which is just basically a room that someone sleeps in and it has an ensuite, it does have so it really is that kitchen, but also more importantly how that space is used really. If you're planning on living there and kind of being self-contained, then we'll be looking at it suspiciously.
And whether it has a kitchen. Yeah. Cool. Does anyone else have any questions?
With a resource consent, does it have to be notified to neighbours?
That depends on the rules that are breached. So we do like to do a site visit if you put in a resource consent. Once we know what rules are breached by a proposal, then there's some rules which can have an effect on neighbours. Say, for instance, you want to put your tiny house within the minimum setback from a side boundary. Obviously that's sort of a loss of has an impact on the neighbour's property, and depending on the extent of the non-compliance, so we may deem them affected. So it just depends on each circumstances and which rules are breached.
And does that get put on the title of the property if the resource consent is granted?
No, it doesn't go on the title.
It would go on the loan.
It goes on land information and memorandum, yes.
Thank you.
I'm just curious, does the council see tiny houses as a viable option, sustainable option in our housing crisis?
Low density.
My colleagues obviously would deal with it in terms of any other application, whether it's a house or a building, just because it's a tiny house. My colleagues are not really going to treat that any differently. But certainly from a housing policy point of view, yes, it's very fair to say that we're interested and we do want to do our best to encourage alternative types of housing to address a range of pressing housing needs, particularly within the affordable housing area, affordable home ownership, affordable rental. We know there are some pressing demographic issues that are only going to get better. So we are certainly trying to be as open-minded as we possibly can, and I hope you've gathered that from the spirit of the answers that are given to you.
And also the fact that council have been here willing to come to these sort of meetings and actually sit at the table with us when we came there with our concerns. It was sort of, each coming halfway with our concerns and then going back and working through them. So, as chair, I think so far we've built a pretty good relationship with City Council, and I can only see that progressing in the future.
Well, the government's been so keen on the Kiwi building 100,000 houses, or cheap price of $600,000 or whatever. I think they're more likely to listen to you guys than they are to us, probably. What, did I say that? But if you've got solutions to housing problems, then talk to your local MP or give them a go. See if they can make any changes to any legislation. Might not make any change. Be heard. Be heard. You are a solution. It's a specific little bespoke thing, but it's an international type thing that's happening. I don't think the government can afford to ignore it, because same with Airbnb's all popped out of the woodwork. It's creating huge problems because people change the use of their buildings without going through due process. But something the government needs to deal with as a whole.
What about family flats? Well, I'm from Selwyn.
Yep.
We're actually in an argument with Selwyn Council about our family flat. Well, why doesn't the government do something about that? Because they want to kick our tenants out because they're classed as a family flat.
Okay.
So there's hundreds of family flats around.
Yeah.
And they're not allowed to rent them out.
Yeah, well that's where we've changed from having family flats to more having the minor residential units, and that's planning rules which are individual to councils, so obviously we can't deal with Selwyn's rules. Yeah. But our rules have changed too.
Well, why doesn't central government do something about it? I went to Amy Adams, she didn't want to know anything about it.
Okay.
Perhaps just on that, I believe that Selwyn is, correct me if I'm wrong, they're about to review their district plan again in a
4
year or
years.
two. Sometime soon, don't they? Who knows, they may follow our lead.
And I presented to Waimak Council last week, and they're actually currently forming their own district plan at the moment. So I mean, if anyone's got anything they want to contribute to that, I'm not that great at legislation. So if anyone is actually keen to actually start working with a council that's working through a district plan now, in the hope of actually pushing something forward in the future, there's a pretty good chance now with Waimak Council. Although saying that, they are very conservative and they didn't really like my tiny house jokes.
With the development contribution, that's the thing that's associated with the site. Obviously there's lots of places that have been demolished and the vacant sites. Is there any correlation between what the demand on the site used to be versus what you put on it?
Yeah, absolutely. So if something has been on the site and it's been demolished because it's vacant, there's a credit that sits with that site. So that's like, if you moved off that site afterwards, the same thing. So whatever was there before, there's a credit once it's demolished or whatever, and that lasts for 10 years. So if you were going to put a tiny house on there, you would get the benefit of that credit and you wouldn't have to pay anything.
What? That's the 10 years.
10 years from, so if a house was demolished, the credit would last for 10 years. So if you put something on there within the 10 years, you get the benefit of the credit. So, yeah.
Does it take into account, like, so if you had a 10-bedroom mansion,
no,
right, and then you put 2 tiny houses that are
no, yeah, it doesn't. It's just based. Development contributions work on averaging, so it doesn't really matter what size house you have on there. If it was 10 bedroom or 1 bedroom, it still classed pretty much as one HUI. Yeah, in terms of applying credits. Yeah.
The HUI is
household unit equivalent.
Yes.
So that's the measure that we use. Yeah.
One more question?
Is it legal to have a tiny house or house heat and mains? Can off-grid solar, at least in that respect, legal by itself?
Of the electrical side?
Yeah, like you're just not connected to the mains electricity grid and you have enough solar panels. Is there any issues with that?
You don't have to have electrical. With a small thing there with building code compliance, when you're talking about energy efficiency or how much insulation you need, those provisions actually only apply when you hook up to mains power or use non-renewable resources. So if you've got all solar and burning wood maybe for your heating, then you don't need to comply with the same insulation standards. Just useless information for you. But you still need to comply with the insulation standards to prevent condensation on the inside, which is somewhat less than you need to stop the heat escape. Yeah.
Just on the resource consent side of things as well, there is a rule that states that each residential unit has to be hooked up to the council's reticulated water system for firefighting purposes. And there are some sites around Christchurch, I'm thinking of mainly rural and in banks, where that's not possible. So you need to look at providing some alternative means of fighting fires, basically.
It's an alternative solution.
Yeah.
So, like recently, where there was a river, which they said that they could plug the fire engine into the river, and that it's basically run past the fire brigade to see if the solution is acceptable to them, and if they accept it, then we accept it.
Cool. Alright, is just do another big round of applause for the council. It's been really useful for me personally, I'm sure a lot of you as well, to actually get this information. We'll try and get the slides up, if that's possible. We'll grab the slides and put them online. Hopefully Davis will get included this time.
There's only a couple of notes.
Paul, did you want to?
Oh yeah, no, thanks very much. It's great to come here, and thanks for hosting us here. My point around the slides are Kate and Erin may wish to remove their family photos, I don't know, for when we go through things like that. And of course we're happy to take feedback on the question and answers, so perhaps if we can feed through Kyle if this can be improved over time. So
Yeah, sure. And that's if you just type in CCC tiny house, this comes up as a PDF document, which is I think quite comprehensive and nails pretty much all the questions, or the main questions around Building Act, District Plan, Development Contributions. So I think City Council's done a really good job in providing a resource for us to help inform us. Cool. Anyone who is a member, if you want to sign up at the door, Alana will hopefully be taking down names and taking cash. The membership lasts for a year, and that's access to all workshops, all picnics. So coming into summer now, we're going to start hosting more picnics where people can come and see tiny houses and have a bit of a gathering. Our next workshop is going to be on grey water, and so that's probably going to be over the next couple of months, so stay tuned for that. And yeah, thank you all very much for coming out.